So, yeah.
Okay, hi, good afternoon. My name is Kathy Betcher. Welcome to the Wellesley Free Library. If this is your first time visiting our library, welcome to you, and please come on back for our other programs. Speaking about programs, information sheets are on the first table as you come in the door for our upcoming programs during the rest of April and most of May, and you can always visit our website to get additional information. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter that will be sent via your email. So you'll get the newsletter once a month, and we can also send you reminders a couple of days before an event if you would like. As we do it at the end of all our programs, we offer attendees our evaluation. It's a quick evaluation form just to give us a sense of how you liked the program, how you found out about the program, and if you want to give us any ideas about other programming you'd like to see here at the Wellesley Library, let us know. Happy to hear it. As most always, today's lecture is being filmed by Wellesley Cable, so any of these robot heads you see attached to the walls are cameras, and if there's Q&A, your voices will be picked up as well. Just an FYI. And if you could silence phones, that would be great. And wanted to let you know that the Friends of the Wellesley Free Libraries sponsor many of the programs we have at the library here on Thursday nights and Sunday afternoons. Please support them. They have a wonderful, wonderful book sale coming up at the end of April. Used books at great prices. Books, this whole room will be filled with books. So come, join them, and support the library. Now, I am very pleased to introduce Jim Klumpp. Jim is a longtime resident of Newton, where he and his wife raised 3 children. He is a software engineer and has been a volunteer instructor with the Girls Who Code program here at the library in Jackie's room. You've been doing that for about 4 years. Jim is also an outdoors enthusiast who has been hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire for 5 decades. In the summer of 2014, he thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail, leaving northern Georgia in early April and reaching the summit of Mount Katahdin in Maine in late August. Within days of returning home, the impact of his journey began to sink in, and he started planning his next adventure, to hike the Pacific Crest Trail. Let's give a warm welcome to Jim Klumpp. Thank you for being here.
So thanks everybody for coming and giving up your Sunday when the final day of the Masters is on. I know it's tough to compete with that. So yeah, I'd like to talk about my through hike of the Pacific Crest Trail last summer. Just a quick definition, through hike is when you hike the entire length of the trail in a single year. Some people do it in 1 year, as I did. Other people take years or even decades to complete a trail, and that's called a section hike. Just a quick background on what the PCT is. It's a footpath that runs from the Mexican border to the Canadian border. It's about 2,650 miles, goes through 3 states, California, Oregon, and Washington. It's got a little over 400,000 feet of verticals. That's the amount of up and down you go. And that's equivalent to walking from the sea level to the top of Everest about 15 times. The highest point is Forester Pass at just over 13,000. And it typically takes people 3 to 6 months to do the hike. In my case, it took just over 4 months. In order to actually be allowed to hike the PCT, you need to get a permit, and they issue 50 of those per day. And the completion rate on the PCT is about 25%. So when you're standing there at the southern border and you look to your left and to your right, you think to yourself, well, 3 of the 4 of us are not going to make it. So you really don't necessarily know that you're going to be one of the lucky ones. In terms of the actual trail itself, or the sections, there's kind of 5 logical sections of the trail. The first 700 miles, starting from Mexico, go through Southern California, and it's mainly desertous. So it's kind of high desert, so anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 feet. A lot of cactus, a lot of chaparral, and it's quite dry. There's not a whole lot of water, so it tends to be very hot during the day and quite cold at night. And at 700 miles, you hit the High Sierra, and so that's where you reach the highest point on the PCT. You walk pretty close to the highest point in the lower 48, Mount Whitney, just basically a day trip away. And you also go through a bunch of snow-covered passes, and you have to ford, at times, fairly scary rivers to make it through there. And then once you get through the High Sierra, there's about 600 miles before you get to the Oregon border. Once you get to Oregon, it gets substantially easier. So for the next 450 miles, it's relatively flat, and the actual path you're walking on is fairly smooth. So typically, most people, including myself, really pick up the pace once they get to Oregon. And finally, there's Washington, 500 miles. It actually then gets substantially tougher again. The climbs get longer. In Oregon, you might be climbing, 1,000 feet up, 1,000 feet down. In Washington, it's more like 2,000 or 3,000 feet. It's also pretty rocky and quite remote. And then the blue graph here just illustrates the number of completions per year. So the far right, this represents 2018. And this is not only through-hike completions, it's basically people who might have section hiked and done their final miles in the trail in 2018. And you'll see here that 2017 was relatively low rate. And that's because 2017, actually like this year, had record snowfalls. And so a lot of people simply weren't able to make it through when they actually completed their hike in 2018. So just over 1,000 people finished the trail last year. And that represents about 1/6 of the total people who ever finished the trail. So about 6,000 people have actually made it the entire length of the PCT. So this is the group I started with at the southern terminus. You can see the Mexican border just off to the far left there with the barbed wire and so forth. And of the 18 people I was with at the Trail Angels in San Diego that I stayed with the night before, and these Trail Angels actually fed us and drove us to the border the next morning. Of those 18, 5 people ended up making it to the end, so just over 25%. So an hour up the trail, I can just about smell Canada at this point. Turns out this first day was just about knocked me off the trail. It was extremely hot. I had just flown in from Boston where there was still snow in the ground. This day was maybe 80, 90 degrees. I was carrying 7 liters of water when I started that day. The last 5 miles went up this south-facing slope right into the afternoon sun, and I just about died trying to get up there. And I was really having serious doubts about whether maybe I was going to be one of the 3 or 4 who didn't make it. And the next morning, actually, I went over to the little store where I'd slept that night to get some Wi-Fi so I could post my journal. And there was a guy there, obviously a thru hiker, and I asked him, "Oh, are you waiting for the store to open?" And he says, "No, I'm waiting for a bus." So obviously, when you're going through the desert, water is a big concern. And despite its color, this is not orange Gatorade. So I took on maybe 4 liters of water here, and I used a filter the entire length of the trail. So one of these blue bags, you fill it with water, squeeze it through a charcoal filter, and that's the way you clean your water. Never got any Giardia or anything, so I think the filter worked for me as it did on the AT. My 4th night on the trail, I slept below the ridge here. I was fortunate because the winds up on the ridge that night were extremely strong, and a couple of people who didn't make it off the ridge that night had some serious problems. One of the guys, his tent actually snapped as a result of the high winds. Pretty much all through Southern California, the winds are extremely intense. So this is kind of the view that you get in much of the way through Southern California. You might be up at 6,000 or 7,000 feet. Off to the right is the desert floor there. As you get up to higher elevations, it gets cooler. When you get down to the desert floor, it can be up to 90 or 100 degrees. So you definitely tend to like to be up on the ridge when you can be. And this is a kind of a closer look at what the trail looks like through Southern California. So you see it kind of winds around the side of these ridges, maintaining more or less the constant elevation. The PCT is not only set up for foot travel, but also for equestrian travel. So there's limits as to the steepness that the actual treadway can be. That's one of the reasons why the PCT is 400,000 or so vertical, whereas the AT, which is 500 miles shorter, is actually 100,000 feet more vertical, because the AT, when it gets to the edge of a mountain, just goes straight up and straight down. The PCT tends to wind along the edge with lots of switchbacks to make it less steep. And then when you get down to the desert floor, such as this, you'd see a lot of really dry, brown grass and so forth. It's fairly inhospitable. You can also see a bunch of windmills in the background there. So California, in a couple of years, is going to get over half their energy from wind and solar. And so one of the things you see a lot going through Southern California is windmills. So just a week or so out, I got I actually had blisters after a day, and this toenail I lost. I won't stay on that too long. So one of the things that people like to do is try to avoid the mid-afternoon sun when the heat of the day is highest. And so here I am putting down my tent footprint here just to get out of the sun for an hour or so. Yeah, so I probably saw 10 or so rattlesnakes, mostly through Southern California. You talk about getting a jolt of adrenaline. You'll be walking along, and all of a sudden you'll hear the rattle of a rattlesnake, and it'll just, your mind was just kind of relaxed and kind of thinking to yourself, and the next minute you're in, full alert. But the good thing about rattlesnakes is because they rattle, they're trying to alert you of their presence, and so they basically give you a chance to get out of their way. So 3 people I hiked with early on, Medicine Woman on the left, Wanderer and Mustache on the right. And the 2 on the left were from Calgary, and Wanderer in the middle, I found out later, I only hiked with him for a week or 2 way down south. I found out later that he had to be rescued off of one of the passes in the High Sierra by helicopter because he'd post-holed and basically taken a chunk out of his lower leg when it hit a rock below the snow. And Mustache here, her trail name came from the fact that she had a little inside joke going with her sister where on Monday she would wear a fake mustache. And she's actually a really impressive woman. She's a former Air Force pilot who now flies planes in and out of Iraq. So she's a pretty tough cookie. So the first really high peak that I climbed, Mount San Jacinto. It's a mountain that my parents had hiked a number of times. They used to live in Southern California. And I was thinking about them a lot when I was going up this mountain. My mom actually passed away 6 months before I started the hike. So I basically did this hike in her memory. And I just had a lot of memories going through my head when I was getting up here. Because of the first time I really got up to high elevation, almost 11,000 feet here, I was also sucking wind pretty seriously trying to get up to the summit. So from the top of San Jacinto, you look off to the northeast there, and somewhere down there is Palm Springs, 10,000 feet below, and probably another 30 or 40 degrees hotter. And so the next day, we dropped down those 10,000 feet, and you'll see a bunch of hikers congregated here. And the reason, or the attraction here, was the water faucet. Again, water is pretty sparse in Southern California, so whenever there's water, you got to camel up and fill up. So here we are, kind of in the middle of the desert, but a nice stream is flowing down from the, basically consisting of melted snow from the high summits. So the 4 of us here were splashing around like kids in their plastic pool in the backyard. A couple days later, a storm came through. This is just outside of Big Bear. So I had been hiking with Mustache at the time. She decided to take a couple of zeros. A zero is a complete day off, so no mileage on the PCT. And after a single zero, I was like itching to go. So I took off and kept going. The 6 inches of snow by the end of the day, it's so hot and dry in the desert that it just had completely melted. This is one of my places where I cowboy camped at the edge of Silverwood Lake. So cowboy camping is when you don't sleep in your tent, but rather just sleep out under the stars. And one person I met early on in the desert kind of got me into cowboy camping, and I pretty much did that the entire way through the desert. Not only does it save time in not having to set up your tent, but it's also awesome just to be able to open your eyes and look at the stars up in the ceiling. One of the best mountains that I climb, Mount Baden-Powell, just north of Los Angeles. On a clear day, you can look to the west and see the Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, I didn't have a clear day. There's a list of things you have to do on the PCT, one of which is to cowboy camp on the top of Baden-Powell. And so I was going to do that, but when I got there was really strong winds, and it was maybe 40 degrees. And I figured that I was probably going to survive, but it wouldn't have been a lot of fun. So instead, I hiked a few more miles to the north and cowboy camp with this group of 7 or so people below the tree line, where there's a bit more protection from the wind. So when you get up to 7,000 or 8,000 feet along the PCT, all of a sudden you get into the trees, and it's just spectacular walking here because these California pines are dropping pine needles, and the tread is nice and soft. It's like wearing your bathroom slippers, and you get some shade from the trees. It's really quite awesome. Also through Southern California, you get these great sunrises and sunsets pretty much every day. So when you get close to the Mojave Desert, there's a series of kind of oases. There's people who are called trail angels. They will host through hikers, and this particular place is called Hiker Heaven, and they have probably, the night I was there, maybe 20 or 30 people sleeping in their backyard. They have outdoor showers, charging stations for your phone and battery and so forth, and they'll drive you into town to resupply. So this is one of 3 or 4 of these oases kind of going across the edge of the Mojave. So anybody know what this is here? Water. Yeah, that's like the California Aqueduct. And this is probably, I don't know, a 12-foot diameter pipe. And if it weren't for this pipe here, LA would not exist in its current form. The strange thing about this is when you're through hiking, there's like enormous amounts of water so close at hand, but none of it is actually available to us. So we actually had to go about 15 miles before there was a faucet that allowed us to access some of that water. I actually got kind of lucky going through the Mojave in that, normally a lot of through hikers choose to night hike because it can be 90, 100 degrees during the day here. I actually had a nice kind of cool spell where it was only maybe 70 or 80. So I'm not a particular fan of night hiking, so I was able to day hike through here because it wasn't all that hot. So here's another example of the windmills in Southern California. This is the Tehachapi Wind Farm, and I think there's altogether about 5,000 windmills here. The biggest ones are 1.5 megawatts per mill. Even though they're kind of far away and they don't look so big, the actual towers are about 200 feet tall, and the blades themselves are about 100 foot long each. So this is what the trail looks like going down into the highway that goes into Tehachapi. So you'll see here the switchbacks. So if this trail were in New England, it'd probably go straight down that slope. But since we're out in California, it's longer, but it's a lot easier going down because it's less steep. Random picture here. I'm out in the middle of nowhere and came across these cows. They didn't seem to want to move off the trail, and even though they're just cows, I didn't really want to have a confrontation with them. So when I started walking up slowly, eventually they all just at once took off and ran down the slope. This is by far my favorite camping spot in the whole PCT. This is a Joshua tree. It's kind of a mix between a normal tree and a cactus. So the only thing you want to be aware of is you don't want to like wake up in the middle of the night and stand up quickly and get yourself a head full of cactus quills. They could really do a number on you, especially if you got one in the eye. But I was up at maybe 6,000 feet looking off to the east at the Mojave Desert floor, 10 or so miles off in the distance. And despite it being exceptionally dry all the way through California, there's still some magnificent color here. Purples in this case, but there was some fields of yellow and red. So I don't know if you can see it here, but way, way off in the distance, there's a line of white on the top of those mountains, and that was actually my first definitive view of the High Sierra. So I've gone just about 700 miles at this point, and I'm transitioning now between Southern California and the next section. And so when you get to Kennedy Meadows, which is the official transition between the desert and the High Sierra, there's this store here where you can get some beers and hot dogs and hamburgers. And whenever a new hiker walks down the trail to this little patio here, everybody on the patio starts clapping for them. So it's and it's a real, it feels like a real milestone to make it through the desert. So here we are starting to head up into the High Sierra. You see it's looking a little more green now. There's more water around. And two of the people that I hike with off and on through from the High Sierra all the way up to Northern California, on the left is Lost Girl, and on the right is Double Shot. And so people, when they get out on the trail, they get these trail names. And so you can imagine why Lost Girl got her trail name. She, I guess, lost the trail a few times. And Double Shot, he is a former employee of Starbucks, and he was a real big coffee drinker. So this is actually down in the town of Lone Pine, and you can look back up there and see the tops of the mountains of the High Sierra. So when I was going through, just before I entered, or early on in the south end of the High Sierra, I got off the trail for 3 days because my wife came and visited me. And what does a thru hiker do on his day off? Well, he goes for a hike. So I actually wanted to bring her back to the previous night's campsite, which is one of the more spectacular ones way up in the High Sierra. So we took maybe a 10-mile hike to go see that. So unfortunately, that visit lasted, it was way too short. And after a few days, it was time to climb back over Cottonwood Pass and on into the real heart of the High Sierra. And the next day, I made it up to the top of Mount Whitney. It's the highest point in the lower 48, at just 14,500 feet. And behind me, somewhere down there, is actually the town of Lone Pine. So you go over Mount Whitney, and then you're really starting to get into the High Sierra here, heading towards Forester Pass, the highest point on the PCT. And this is me at the top of Forester. About a quarter mile before you get to the top, there's this snow slope where you basically have to traverse. It's maybe 45 degrees. And it's a spot where if you were to slip and fall, it'd be all over. You'd slide for maybe a quarter mile into the boulders below, and there's no way, unless you had an ice axe to self-arrest, it'd be really hard to stop your momentum there. I had, so I chose not to use an ice axe because I don't have a lot of experience with that. And furthermore, in order for it to be effective, you have to basically be holding it the whole time. So I chose not to have that. I did have micro spikes, and I put them on for the first time going across that snow chute. So, what? You had snowshoes? I did not have snowshoes, no. So once you get into the passes, but pretty much every day you go over one pass, down to the valley between the next one, and then over the next one the next day. So after Forester, the next pass is Glen. And so what you're looking at here is the trail traversing the north slope of Glen Pass. And it started out not too bad, when you're making this traverse, but when we got to the edge there, it pretty much went straight down the slope. And that was about all I could take in terms of the scariness of that particular descent. So in my opinion, the most beautiful place in the entire PCT is called Ray Lakes. It's just on the bottom of Glen Pass. And this is one of there's, 6 or 7 of the lakes, and this is the first one of them. So this is a lost girl here, making her way up Mojave Pass. Has anybody been up Tuckerman's Ravine in the White Mountains? Yeah, so this pass here felt a lot like Tuckerman's in that there's a very steep head wall, and it kind of gets progressively steeper as you get higher up. And so, the very lip of this thing is almost vertical, and it's written up in the app that we use to navigate as being one of the more scary places along the PCT for good reason. It's probably not so bad when there isn't snow here, but we were going through early enough in the season that there was still substantial snow, typically about 3 or 4 miles on the south side of each pass and 3 or 4, maybe 5 miles on the north side. On the next pass you go over is Muir Pass, named after John Muir, who did a lot of the exploration in the Sierras. Muir Pass was particularly frustrating because there's maybe 3-4 miles of snow on the south side. So it's pretty early on when you're going over the high Sierra passes, you learn that you need to get up well before sunrise to get an early start to get up the snow while it's still frozen from the night before. The later you wait, the sun comes out, it softens up the surface of snow, and then you start to post hole. So you're walking along and all of a sudden your foot just sinks in. And if you're unlucky, like Wanderer, you sink in far enough and injure your leg on a rock below. But even if you don't get injured, the effort that you expend just trying to get yourself out of that hole and keep going is pretty great. And so the north side of Muir Pass is very flat, so you don't lose any elevation, and therefore you don't get below snow line quickly. And so I probably spent 4 or 5 miles just post-holing in deep snow on the north side of Muir Pass, as did everybody else who was with me. It was probably one of the toughest passes that we had to go over. But by far, in my opinion, the most dangerous thing about the PCT, more so than the rattlesnakes and the post-holing through the snow, was the river fords. So this is a notorious river. It's actually called Bear Creek. And my mental picture of what a creek is changed dramatically on the PCT. So I had actually been at a presentation by a thru hiker who'd done the PCT, I think back in 2013, and she had talked about crossing Bear Creek, slipping, getting caught up in the current, and she thought for a moment there she was going to die in this particular creek. In my case, it was about mid-thigh deep. The current was rushing extremely fast, so you could feel the current just trying to push you down the river. And it was all you could do to just keep your feet. And it was almost impossible to use your poles, because as soon as you stuck your pole into the water, the basket would catch the current and just get flung downstream. So Bear Creek, I managed to make it across unscathed, but it was a few tense moments there. About a half mile later, after Bear Creek, I came to another crossing, a tributary of Bear Creek, and I decided, because my feet had been so wet throughout the entire High Sierra from all the river fords, I decided to not cross in my trail runners, but rather to take them off and use my Crocs, like rubber shoes. Well, that was a mistake. So I went down in the tributary. Fortunately, it wasn't as big as Bear Creek, but it probably took me 30 seconds to, I went down face first, was in the water, maybe 2 feet deep. It took me 30 seconds to right myself, and I had my phone in my front pocket. Well, first thing I did when I got across the river was to check my phone. Great, it worked. Well, an hour later, it died. So I was all alone. without any navigation. Turns out I lost all the pictures I'd had up until this point. So a couple of these pictures here are actually ones I borrowed from other hikers I met along the way. And had no way to communicate as well. So probably the scariest day I had on the entire PCT was this day when I basically fell in this river and lost my phone. And later in the day, same day, I had to go across this one where you got a waterfall coming down on your right, spray in your face, and then there's another waterfall to your left. And you can clearly see that if you lose your footing and go down that other waterfall, forget about it. It was a pretty tense day that day. So that night I was in my tent and I was dearly hoping for somebody else to come along just to have some companionship and so forth. Nobody came along. And when I was in my sleeping bag that night, my mind was kind of playing tricks on me, and I was thinking that everybody probably had gone down this waterfall and just perished. And part of that was due to the fact that in 2017, again, a very high snow year, 2 people did die in river crossings in the High Sierra. But I managed to make it to Mammoth unscathed, and I met up with Lost Girl and Double Shot, as well as a couple other people there, and boy, that beer tastes good. And so in Mammoth is where I sorted out my phone situation, got a new phone, had to rewrite a week or so's worth of journal entries, and it actually took me about 2 weeks before I fully caught up with my journal. And although we'd made it through most of the big passes of the High Sierra, there were still a couple to go, including Donahue Pass. And just to give you a scale here, there's actually a hiker up on that rock there. And the hard part about this pass is the fact that it was filled with these sun cups. So this is when the snow melts at an uneven rate for some reason due to the sun. And when you're walking along this thing, you try to stay on the little ridges there. But I've never post-holed so much in my life, even early in the morning, and I was just completely frustrated getting up to the top of here. The good news is that once you got over Donahue Pass, down the other side was Yosemite National Park, and that was an absolutely beautiful place to be. I arrived there with Lost Girl and Double Shot, but because I'd never seen Yosemite Valley, I decided to take a day off and go down to the valley, and Lost Girl and Double Shot went on ahead because they'd already been there. So I got behind them once again. Tuolumne Falls here, spectacular. And just about when we got into Yosemite, the mosquitoes started coming out. So the day I eventually caught up with Lost Girl and Double Shot, I was walking along the trail, and all of a sudden I heard somebody yelling over from the side of the trail. And turns out they were both in their tents, and it turns out they were prisoners in their tents because the mosquitoes were so ferocious at that point. And then the next thing I knew, I was like setting my tent full speed to get inside to avoid the mosquitoes myself. Just a little action shot here. So now that we're pretty much through most of the big pass of the High Sierra, you can try to avoid getting your feet wet by rock hopping like I was doing here. So the 1,000-mile mark was a big milestone for all of us. Now you can see the scrapes I have on my left shin there from all this post-holing that I'd been doing, and Lost Girl and Double Shot had the same set of scars to show as well. So at this point, this shot is looking to the south, and so you can see kind of the peaks of the High Sierra in the background. But in the foreground, what you're seeing here is one of the first kind of volcanic peaks. So the PCT traverses both the Sierra Nevada mountain range plus the Cascades. So at this point, we're starting to make that transition, and pretty much for the rest of the way, are going to be walking, beside these volcanoes all the way up to Canada. Marmots, you see dozens of these along the trail. They're everywhere in the High Sierra. So this is a spot where the trail kind of traverses from right to left along the top and then switches back. I was making the first traverse, and I slipped and started sliding down the snow slope. I jammed my pole in, managed to stop myself, but when I took my pole out of the snow, it was shaped like a banana. And Lost Girl was right behind me, and she was laughing at me, and the next thing I knew, she had dropped her water bladder. By that time, I was making the next traverse, and the bladder came right down to me, and I was able to stop it. Otherwise, she would have lost it. We camped beside this lake one night, and this was the sunrise we saw the next morning. So at this point, we're getting close to South Lake Tahoe, which is kind of the official end of the High Sierra. And I had my cousin's sister lives in South Lake Tahoe, and so we'd been in touch before my trip, and she invited me to stay with her when I came through. And so I got in touch with her and said, well, I've got these two friends with me. And she said, well, bring them along. And so we stayed with her. And one of the things that I was telling Lost Girl and Double Shot about is this tradition on the Appalachian Trail, which I'd hiked 4 years earlier, called the half-gallon challenge, where when you reach the halfway point, you try to eat a half-gallon within 30 minutes. And so Lost Girl, it turns out, is extremely competitive. So not only did she want to take part in the half-gallon challenge, but she wanted to challenge Double Shot and me to see who could actually finish fastest. And only after Double Shot and I had agreed to her challenge did she tell us that she was actually her county's champion in the county pie eating contest. So she was, of course, trash talking us a lot before this challenge took place. And in the end, the winner was Double Shot. He ate a half-gallon of ice cream in 23 minutes. And I came in second at 27, and Lost Girl was 29 minutes. So, of course, then Double Shot was, trash talking big time, and he had the song Queen, We Are the Champions on his phone, and he'd play that every morning. So the last significant snow we had to go over was over Dix Pass. So we're now, I've left South Lake Tahoe. Actually, Lost Girl and Double Shot spent an extra day there to meet a friend. My plans were to meet my daughter, Sonia, who's actually sitting up in the corner here, and my wife. They were going to come out and meet me at the north end of the High Sierra. So I took off a day early to meet them. This is a campsite I had, and that's Lake Tahoe in the background. I'm about a quarter mile from the chairlift at Squaw Valley this night. And now we're clearly in Northern California. You'll see there's not the massive snow-covered mountains in the distance. It's a lot hillier, less mountainous. And you spend a lot of time in Northern California kind of on ridge walks like this, or passing through fields of what's called moose ears like this. So I'd been on the trail for 2 months, and my wife and I had arranged to meet in Sierra City, which is within Sierra County, so up in the red, just a little northeast of Sacramento here. But 2 months from Mexico up to Northern California, still had about 500 miles to go to get to Oregon. And anyway, Sonia and my wife Tor met me in Sierra City, and we took 4 days off in a town called Truckee in the north end of Lake Tahoe. Beautiful place, highly recommended. And the timing was actually excellent because the day before I met them here, I'd come down with a really bad case of shin splints. And so I spent like that 4 days taking ibuprofen, getting healings from my wife, who's an energy healer, doing just about anything I could, icing it, trying to get the pain to go away. And they say shin splints can take as long as a month to heal, and I had 4 days to get over it. So anyway, here is Sonia and my wife leaving me back at the trail. I didn't have my wife in this picture because she was too upset at the time. So after 4 days, my shin felt a little better. but I made it exactly 3 miles from here up the trail before there was so much pain in my shin that I had to basically turn around and go back to Sierra City. By that time, Sonia and my wife had driven back to the San Francisco airport, so I basically spent the night at the campground behind the church, you know, keeping my fingers crossed that I was going to have some sort of dramatic healing that night. And the next day I said, you know, I'm going to give it another try. And the next day I managed to do 20 miles, plenty of ibuprofen, but somehow that, you know, the shin splints more or less had gone away, or at least decreased substantially overnight there. This is a place called Sierra Buttes, and it reminded me kind of a stegosaurus with these peaks off in the distance there. The campsite under that Joshua tree was my #1 campground. This had to be 1A. This was up on a ridge with a 180-degree panoramic view from the west to the north to the east. So I had both a really nice sunset that night and a great sunrise the next morning. I was concerned because I got here really late and I was thinking there was going to be a bunch of tents there already, but turns out I had the spot all to myself. So one of the really strange places that we went through was a place called Belden. And I had never heard of the term rave before, but it's like this weekend-long rock concert that was going on here, and all these kind of pseudo-hippies from Los Angeles were there that night. And you know, normally when thru hikers pass through an area, they're kind of the center of attention. People stare at them. But I can guarantee you that people were actually staring a lot more at the people at this rave here. So the next day, managed to make it to the halfway point. So this little monument here said 1,325 miles to Mexico, 1,325 miles to California. When I was on the Appalachian Trail and I hit the halfway point, I was ecstatic. But then the next day I almost went into a depression because I realized that, you know, I worked really hard to get to the halfway point, but I had to do it all again. So I played a little mental trick to myself and told myself that for every step I took north towards Canada, I was 2 steps further away from the Mexican border. So anyway, I didn't really have the same issue on the PCT. So you go through some volcanic area at Lassen Park, which is really the first very significant volcano that you pass along the PCT. And so here you have kind of steam rising out of the ground like they have in Yellowstone. So this couple in this RV here, they just happen to rent this campground like 20 yards from the PCT, and they had no idea the PCT was there. But the next morning, they see all these thru hikers going through all day, and so they got the idea to become trail angels. And they went into town and bought soda and beer and fruit and Twinkies and, you know, all that other good stuff that thru hikers like. And every day they had this little impromptu, you know, trail magic where thru hikers would stop by, sit down, and, you know, get some extra calories in them. And it was awesome. The amazing thing is that they were from Alabama, and in this picture were 2 other hikers from Alabama as well. So 4 of the 7 people here actually are from Alabama. So one of the waterfalls here in Northern California, let's see, actually the names escape me right now, but the thing about this that amazed me is that you're walking through this extremely dry territory. And when I say dry, I literally had maybe 1 day of rain, like a little bit of rain during 1 day for the first 3 months in the PCT. So it just, you know, from like April to July, it never rains here. And I just couldn't imagine why or how you could get so much water in one place in such a dry area. So Mount Shasta, it's a humongous volcanic peak in Northern California. The PCT actually approaches Mount Shasta from the south, takes a big wide arc around it, and leaves it kind of from due north. So you've actually got views of Mount Shasta from various perspectives for about 10 days straight. So here we are waiting for a hitch into town. The guy in the foreground, his name is Kickstand. And in 2018, in the beginning of February, he started in Georgia on the beginning of the AT, hiked up to Vermont where he hit deep snow. So he flew out to New Mexico, hiked to Colorado, hit deep snow again, flew to San Diego, hiked the entire PCT, went back to Vermont, finished up the AT, went to Canada, and finished the CDT. It's called a calendar triple crown. There's only a handful of people who've ever done it. It's about 8,000 miles total.
Oh, wow.
So we're in Etna, California, pretty close to the border here. The guy in the foreground, my wife thought he looks like a werewolf. He's actually from, what's the island just south of Australia? Tasmania, thank you. So he's from Tasmania. He's a pretty wild guy. And he would be a pretty hard partier in town, and he'd sleep in every morning. And then I'd be the first one up, get going at 6 a.m. And just every day he would pass me towards the end of the day. And I found out later that he actually he represented Australia in the race walking competition in the Olympics. So he's kind of an unusual character. So Northern California, it was getting pretty warm at this point. There was quite a bit of heat waves. You can understand when you hike the PCT why they have all the fires out there. I actually lucked out and went through Syed Valley on Sunday when it was only 99 degrees. And this is the morning that I got up really early to try to make it to Syed Valley, because on a Sunday, the place where you can get hamburgers and milkshakes and so forth closed at 2 o'clock. And I had 25 miles to cover before that time if I wanted to eat. So the night before, I thought there's no way I can make 25 miles by 2 o'clock. Well, by morning, I decided I was going to try to make it. And I actually got there by 1 and managed to get a hamburger and a milkshake and a bunch of soda and stuff. But anyway, this is a sunrise that I had that morning. So after being on the trail for just over 3 months, I finally got to the Oregon-California border. And I swear that the week or two before I got to this place, I had Hotel California going through my head. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. It felt like I was never going to get out of California. I was sitting at the border, and for the first time in months, it started to rain. And that was fine. The problem was that we also got some thunder, and that thunder triggered some fires. And so just after getting into Oregon, I got my first brush with a fire, crested this ridge, looked down in front of me, and there's this mushroom cloud of smoke coming out of the valley. And I was crushed because the trail looked like it was going straight there. And I wondered to myself why they hadn't closed the PCT at this point. Fortunately, the trail took a right-hand turn, followed this ridge along the side of the valley, and to your left, you could look down and see smoke billowing up. A day or two later, they actually did close the PCT due to this fire. So some people, unfortunately, didn't get a chance to go across the border there. They had to detour around that particular major milestone along the PCT. But anyway, from this point forward, fires played a really big role in my through hike. In Oregon, there was just smoke pretty much everywhere, and it was probably really bad for your lungs, but it affected the views greatly, and you constantly felt like a fire was going to affect your ability to actually make it up the trail. And in fact, the next day there was another fire up in Oregon, and I met these two guys in a youth hostel in Ashland, Oregon, and there was a fire that had closed 17 miles of PCT. And so at the hostel, they were telling me, yeah, we're just going to hitch a ride around that closure. And I said, well, there's no way I'm going to miss walking from Mexico to Canada. So if the trail's closed, I'm going to do a road walk. So anyway, the next morning they woke up, and I guess I'd placed a guilt trip on them because the next day, both of them joined me on a 17-mile road walk to avoid the trail closure. On the left is Red Cross from England, and on the right is Max from Georgia. And I'd actually hiked on and off all the way to Canada with Max. So when you get up into Oregon, you also start crossing these lava fields. This one wasn't particularly bad because you can see the tread is fairly smooth. But some of the ones further up the trail were pretty brutal on your feet when you're kind of walking on golf ball-sized rocks the whole way. And this is a place I'm pretty sure it burned maybe the year before or 2 years before. This is the sun rising through a burn. Max and I actually slept in kind of a little oasis in the middle of this 5-mile burn area. It was a place that for some reason had been spared from the flames. Yeah, this is pretty typical of what we saw, all the way through Oregon and Washington. So we made it to Crater Lake. And even here, I'd been to Crater Lake a few decades before this. Normally, it's a really spectacular place, but there's so many fires and so much smoke in the area that the views were a little bit degraded just due to all the smoke. Mount Thielsen, another volcanic peak heading up through Central Oregon at this point. So this is pretty much what my feet look like at the end of every day. It's just impossible to, you get so much dust and sand on the trail that it just permeates your socks and shoes. On a good day, I'd be able to camp near water and wash my feet off. And on a bad day, that is maybe 70% of the time, I'd just go to bed just like this. Fortunately, in Oregon, there are a lot of really beautiful lakes along the way. This is Lower Rosemary Lake, but there aren't a lot of rivers. So although there's plenty of water to get, to put water in your water bottle with, I preferred to get water out of rivers just because the water's moving, it's not stagnant. Another volcanic rock field here, a little rougher than the previous one. And then just as we got on the north end of that, you have a pretty good view of Mount Washington to the left, Three Finger Jack next, Mount Jefferson, and then in the very back, the white-colored Mount Hood. And Mount Hood is just just to the south of the Columbia River, which marks the transition between Oregon and Washington. But in this picture, it's actually about 100 miles off. So here are Max and Cheap. Cheap's on the left. And this place is called Big Lake Youth Camp. It's a camp run by the Seventh-day Adventists, but they are very welcoming of through hikers. They've actually built this little hut where hikers can do laundry, take showers, charge your equipment. There's a hiker box there for exchanging food with, if you have extras, you throw it in the box. If you need stuff, you take it from the box. And Cheap is he was a college student from Missouri who was on a very limited budget. So at this point, he had actually only spent $500 on the entire hike, which is probably a quarter of what I spent, or a sixth maybe. And his technique was just whenever he got to a place like this where there's a hiker box, when people threw stuff in it, he would take it right out and use it for himself. And this is where we slept on a nice sandy beach at Big Lake Youth Camp. So now I'm at the 2,000-mile mark, so getting pretty close to the border of Washington. You can see my shoes have seen better days. So I had a new pair of shoes waiting for me in Portland, Oregon, about 150 miles up the trail. So I was reluctant to get off trail to get a new pair of shoes just for 150 miles. So I figured I'd push these ones as far as I could. This is Mount Jefferson. In particular, we're looking south here at the north face of the peak. And those are real live glaciers there. Actually, when I was hiking along the trail, just a little south of here, I met 4 guys with like full climbing equipment who'd got to the top of Jefferson by way of one of these glaciers. And so basically, if you turn 180 degrees from where the previous picture was taken, you look north here, here's a snowfield along the PCT. It's now late July, and we're still walking through snow in places. But you can see here I'm about maybe 100 miles or so away from Mount Hood, or maybe 50 miles. My feet finally, or my shoe finally broke, ripped all the way across. And what I was finding is every time I'd like stub my toe, my toes would pop out. And then I'd have to take my shoes off to stick my toes back in. So I basically built myself a little strap out of duct tape, put a slit in the toe area of my shoe, tied it to my shoelaces, and this got me the last 100 miles through Oregon. So this is another burn area, but it was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and it's already started to recover somewhat. So with all the other danger, like snow and rivers and snakes and so forth, I was lucky that the Yeti danger is only medium here. So here we are racing up the side of Mount Hood. And the reason we're racing up was because there was an all-you-can-eat breakfast buffet at Timberline Lodge. And so we basically laid waste to that all-you-can-eat. And I think it was about $18, and I swear every thru hiker probably ate $30 worth of food, including this guy here. His name is Clax, one of my favorite hikers in the whole trail. He couldn't have weighed more than 150 pounds. And I watched him carry 3 completely stuffed plates back to his table and consume it all. He had actually hiked 60 miles the previous day to get here. But here he is in the throes of a full-fledged food coma. So somebody asked me, I actually gave this talk last Monday, and they said, well, how long does it take you between the time when you eat and like when you're hungry again? And the answer is about 15 minutes. Maybe this time it was only a half hour for Clax. So that's Mount Adams on the far side of the Columbia River. We're still in Oregon, but you can just barely make out the Columbia River about 4,000 feet below. And at this point, my shoes, there's like nothing left. The inserts were paper thin. There was almost no tread. And this trail going down to Columbia was very rocky, and it was probably one of the more painful 10 miles I did descending down to the river. But I did manage to make it to the Bridge of the Gods, which connects Oregon to Washington. And at this point, I got off trail for 4 days. My brother and his wife live in Beaverton, Oregon, just west of Portland. And I needed a break here. I've been pushing really hard to get through Oregon. And furthermore, my dad came out to visit me. My dad was 87 at the time, and that's my brother on the left. And the plan was for him to actually hike a portion of the PCT with me. He'd wanted to join me on the Appalachian Trail 4 years earlier, but unfortunately my mom was in really bad health there, so he wasn't able to make it. But I was thrilled that he could join me for a 5-mile trek on the PCT, and he was thrilled as well. And you can see here I've got bright, brand new red shoes. So I did a quick shopping list prior to resupplying or doing my resupply for Washington. So Washington is extremely remote, and the only places to resupply involve like a 20 or 30 mile hitch into towns from road crossings that the PCT goes across. So instead, what I and most other hikers do is they send themselves food to various places along the way. So for example, I sent the box to White Pass, Snoqualmie, Stevens, and Tehican. And I estimated it was going to take about 21 days to get to Manning Park in Canada at the end of the trail. And this is what my resupply looked like. my sister-in-law actually drove me around to all the various places to shop for food. And when she looked at my shopping cart and this mound of chocolate bars on the top and then a toothbrush sitting on top of that, she said to me, I don't know why you need that toothbrush. Diabetes is going to get you long before your teeth fall out. You'll see Fritos here. So each of these kind of vertical rows represents one resupply box. And so I had a bag of Fritos for every resupply. And the reason for Fritos is because I'd learned on the AT they're one of the highest calorie to weight ratios of any food you can get. Somebody asked me where all the protein was. I guess, when you're hiking the PCT, all you're doing is thinking about calories. Although there is protein in like the Mountain House meals here, you get beef stew or spaghetti with meat sauce or whatever. That gives a little bit of protein. But really, in the PCT, it's all about calories. And you might think that, eating this sort of diet would be really unhealthy, but I actually found that aside from the shin splints and a few other minor issues, I felt more healthy than I've ever felt in my life along the PCT. So my brother drove me back to the border here, and I hiked across the Bridge of the Gods with some section hikers. And a few days later, I was walking through one of the more spectacular places on the entire PCT called Goat Rocks. It reminded me a lot of Switzerland with kind of the green sides of the mountains and snow-covered peaks off in the distance. And then towards the end of Goat Rocks, they have this ridge called the Knife Edge. On a clear day, which unfortunately I didn't have here, you get this fantastic view of Mount Rainier off in the distance. I actually never saw Mount Rainier because there were so many fires and so much smoke in the area. So another fire, a couple of weeks before I got here, a fire had broken out on the PCT just north of here, and it closed that section of the PCT. There was an alternate trail. On the day before I got to the Knife Edge, another fire broke out along the alternate trail. And so when I was up on this ridge, I managed to get a signal. I looked at the PCTA website, the organization that manages the trail, and they had an alternate to the alternate trail. I asked a local about that, and he said, no, there's no way you want to do that. It's like way out of your way. It's up and down. So I was really confused about what to do. So what I ended up doing is deciding instead to try to go through the original alternate trail, which had closed just a day before. And so this is the junction where the PCT is officially closed, the original PCT with the green tape there, and the alternate goes off to the left. So even though I guess this trail was officially closed at the time, they hadn't actually physically closed it. So I zoomed down this trail, and in fact I met a bunch of hikers camped out along it. So I wasn't the only one along this trail, and the new fire was not right on the trail, so I did manage to make it through unscathed. But as I was hiking down, this crew of about 30 fighter fires, both men and women, were on their way up. And you can see here one guy's carrying an axe, but they had like these chainsaws with 3-foot bars and axes and shovels and everything else. And they were going to fight that second fire, which was encroaching on this alternate trail. So this is just a typical picture of what it looks like through some of the areas of Washington. Like I said before, and further south in Oregon, you might have 1,000-foot climbs and descents. In Washington, they're more like 2,000 or 3,000 feet at a time. Another fire area, this one, again, extended, 5 or 6 miles. And I ran out of daylight halfway through it, so I was forced to camp in the middle of this burn area. It was pretty windy that night, and all night I heard branches breaking off the dead trees. And I was concerned that a branch was going to hit my tent or an entire tree was going to come down on top of me. Obviously, that didn't happen. But it was a little scary. This is my dining room here. And this is the spot where I had been eating with. You can see here the sun is, barely visible in the sky because of all the smoke in the distance. The section from Snoqualmie to Stevens Pass I thought was particularly rugged. There's a lot of this, very loose rock here, which would go on for miles and miles. There's a lot of steep ups and downs. And in this particular place, there's kind of pretty steep drop-offs along the side of the trail. So you want to be careful with your footing. So 2,500 mile mark, got 500 to go, or 150 to go. I'm getting pretty excited here. This is Glacier Peak National Park, another spectacular place in Washington. And this valley here again in Glacier Peak. It's hard to get a sense of the scale here, but it's probably 3 or 4 miles wide and 10 miles from where the picture is taken down to the bottom there. I was happy this bridge was there even though it was broken, because you could still get across it, and trying to ford that river would have been kind of nasty. So if you took a really big step from one side to the other, you could get across without getting your feet wet. Northern Washington was kind of stark, very rugged, very remote. There's a typical scenery in that area. This is one place where we camped next to Mica Lake. You can see here there's some snow over there on the opposite side of the lake. There's probably on the length of the trail, there's hundreds of trees down like this. So you have to, in this particular case, you can't, it'd be very hard to climb over this. It's probably 10 feet from the trail up to over that tree. So you basically have to climb through the woods around it. I'm not sure how you would do it if you're on a horse here. So the final fire detour, or at least we thought it was the final detour at the time, was within about 100 miles of the border of Canada. And so Max and I were together at the time, and we took the detour. The detour went through this place called Holden Village, where it was actually run by a church, which you could stay there, fill up on food and so forth. And about halfway from here to the Holden Village, a southbound hiker stopped us and said, I've got some really bad news for you. He said there's another fire north of here, which has closed the PCT all the way to Canada. And I remember writing in my journal that night that I had gone from really energetic and excited to be getting to Holden Village and to be able to eat all the food I wanted, to being so tired I could barely lift my legs from disappointment. And you can kind of see that disappointment on our faces. The woman on the far side of the table is kind of smiling now, but when she first heard about this and came into the cafeteria, she had tears in her eyes. She was actually a 19-year-old who was just finishing off the PCT and was heading off to college in a couple of weeks. So anyway, at this point, we had about a day and a half where we thought that our hike was going to end about 20 miles north of Holden Village, and we were going to miss out on the last 60 miles to Canada. And all of us were crushed. So the detour that we were on at the time involved going through Holden Village, taking a bus to this lake, and taking a ferry up the lake to a place called Stehekin, where my last resupply box was. And on the way from Stehekin to that night's campground in the North Cascades National Park, I met some guys who had heard about an alternate trail 70 miles long to get from the campground we were at to the border of Canada. So it involved not making it to the northern terminus of the PCT, but at least it allowed us to get to Canada. In hearing kind of the details about this route, I said, you know what, I got to give it a try, because I've invested way too much not to go for it. There was just two problems, though. Number one is when I got to Stehekin and got my resupply box, I was under the impression that I wasn't going to be going more than 20 miles up the trail. So I'd given away half my food. When people at the campsite I was at that night got wind of my predicament, all of a sudden, like this pile of food appeared at my feet. So there's a saying on through hiking trails that the trail provides, and that is certainly the case, and that was one of the best examples of that in this particular case. The other issue I had, though, was that I was using a GPS application on my phone, which would tell me if I'd stepped 5 feet off the trail, it would show me that I was off the trail. But in taking this alternate route where I was going to be 20 miles from the PCT, I was outside of the corridor that app's maps covered. So I had no mechanism or means for navigation that last 70 miles to the border. But there just so happened to be a guy at that campground that night named Lickety Split. And he had an application on his phone that basically had all of the maps through the North Cascades National Park where the entire alternate route went. So what he did is he brought up his app. He would show a 10-mile stretch of the trail. I'd take a picture of the front of his phone. He'd scroll to the next 10 miles, and I did that. And I basically had enough information to navigate that 70 miles to the border. So the next morning, I got up bright and early because I had 70 miles to go, and then I had a 30-mile hike back to the highway, and I had 3 days of food to do all that. And so I was kind of, pushing it a little bit. So I needed a really early start. This particular sign here was where I left the PCT for good. And it was kind of a sad point because the PCT had got me, over 26 or around 2,600 miles so far, but it wasn't going to get me to Canada. So I bet at this point, the PCT went to the right and I went to the left, and that was the last time I saw it. I passed early in that first day up to Canada, went over some snow-covered ground here. Now this is August 21st, and we've still got snow up at about 6,000 feet. I went through some pretty wild terrain here. And the first 40 or so miles in that alternate route, I saw exactly one person. So, following that, doing the navigation, it was really critical that I not miss a trail junction or prematurely turn off a trail. Because if I'd gotten lost at this point, it's likely I would have run out of food and been in big trouble. The last day on the trail was along this lake called Ross Lake, so the navigation was considerably easier for the most part. And towards the end of the day, about 5 p.m., I reached the international boundary. And just up the hill from that is a monument, the junction of Canada and the United States. So I had actually met a group of people at a ranger station about a mile south of here, and they were trying to set up a boat to get us down the 30-mile lake to the highway so we didn't have to walk there the next day. So I went and tagged the border, tried to get some pictures here, and when I got back there, they had said, "Yep, this boat's on its way." So I had about 15 minutes to go, and we actually took a boat back to the highway, and we got to the highway just as getting dark, so we had to sleep in the parking lot there. But the next day, we managed to hitch from there, more or less all the way to Seattle, and I managed to catch a red eye that night and got back to my wife and family the next day. So, just, I guess, last slide here. Not too much difference here. Pretty much fresh. Fresh as a daisy there on the right, I would say. Yes, question?
What was your trail name?
My name was Slim.
Slim, okay.
And I had actually brought that name to the trail. In 1976, when I was 17, I bicycled cross country with 3 other people, and we got into the coast of California. We're bicycling down the coast, and we came to this small California town where this born again tried to convert us, and he put on the full court press for about 10 minutes. And because I was the tallest in the group, he looked at me, I guess he thought I was the leader, and he said, well, how about it, Slim? And so I took that name to the AT, and I retained it for the PCT.
How many pairs of shoes?
I went through 4 pairs of shoes, and they all looked pretty much like the ones, yeah, they're pretty beat. Yeah, question?
Who blazed the first trail from California to the border of Canada? How did that originate
Yeah.
and extend?
So I think the way these trails originate is that there's shorter trails, and I don't know so much of the history of the PCT, but the AT basically, two guys decided to kind of connect the set of trails so that there's like a continuous trail all the way from Georgia to Maine, and I think the same thing probably happened to PCT, is just really connecting existing trails. Yeah.
Is the trail complete, or is it still being developed?
Yeah, the PCT is complete. There's a lot of work done on it, and with all these detours and with, periodic improvements to the trails, the trail changes every year. In fact, it generally gets longer because they add more switchbacks. So the year I did it, it was actually 2652, and I think now it's like 2658 or so.
Are there volunteer maintenance crews?
Yeah, there's like thousands of volunteers, including my brother who lives in Portland. He got out there. There's a pretty major fire in end of 2017, and he was out there working on the trail so that his brother could, hike along it the next year. Yeah.
How long is preparation? How many weeks or months did it take you to set it all out?
Yeah. Well, it was about a month after completing the AT in 2014 when I decided I really wanted to do the PCT, and my preparation really began there, more like mental preparation at first. And then actually in 2016, so pretty much midway between hiking the AT and the PCT, I actually had a pretty serious knee injury, a rupture of the quadriceps tendon in my right knee. So basically, I wasn't able to straighten out my right leg from that injury. So anyway, the surgeon sewed it back on, and I went through like 5 or 6 months of intense physical therapy. And but I've always been pretty active in terms of bicycling to work, walking my dog a lot and stuff. But there's really no preparation that can truly get you ready for a through hike rather than just hiking. So you're walking in New England in March and April in 30, 40 degree weather, and then you set down in Mexico in 80 or 90 degree weather. It took me a week to really acclimate to the heat of the desert. Yeah.
Your backpack looks pretty small. What was the contents of it, and how much did it weigh?
You actually switch backpacks. So I had a green one to begin with, and my base weight was maybe 15 to 18 pounds. That's my tent, sleeping bag, clothes, and everything but food and water. And then food, they say you eat about 2 pounds a day. So if you resupply for 10 days or 5 days, it's 10 pounds. And then water, you have to carry considerably more water in various sections of the PCT. So, I think the most water I ever carried was 7 liters, which is about 14 pounds. So my backpack the first day on the trail was the heaviest it ever was, of a little over 40 pounds. And, once you get up to the high Sierra, you don't have to carry any water at all because, there's too much water. Water's abundant. But in terms of resupply, generally you can get to a resupply point every 5 days or so. Going through California, the one exception to that actually is the high Sierra, where it's like there's a 200-mile section with, no road crossings, 1 or 2 places where you can go over a pass to resupply out the side. But I think there was one section of the high Sierra where I had like 6 or 7 days. So I guess generally after resupply, my pack might be low 30 pounds. And just before resupply, when I ate through most of my food, it'd be low 20s.
Why do you switch backpacks?
So the backpack I started with, also used it on the AT, and the zippers were starting to get worn out, and it had seen better days. And my shoulders were also really bothering me a lot. Turns out the new backpack didn't help that. But yeah, it was mainly just getting worn out.
What's your next adventure?
Yeah, so there's the so-called Triple Crown of long distance hiking. So the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest are the first two legs of that. The third one is the biggest, most strenuous, which is the Continental Divide Trail. Toward the latter stages of the PCT, when people had found out I'd done the AT, they said, well, when are you going to do the CDT? And at the time, I was pretty tired, pretty burnt out, working really hard just to get to Canada. And I just said, I don't know if I have it in me to do the CDT. But they would remind me that, you can do one long distance trail, or you can do 3, but you can't stop at 2. So about a month after I got home and I'd recovered and regained some of the 20 pounds I'd lost in the PCT, I made up my mind that I do actually want to do the CDT. But I told my wife, I want to give her plenty of heads up that I won't be doing that till 2022. Any other? Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.